Millionaire rejected 53 women until he saw a nurse make his grandfather smile before he passed away. The millionaire froze in the hospital doorway. His dying grandfather, the man who'd never smiled for anyone, was laughing, actually laughing. The woman holding his hand wasn't like the other 53. She wasn't even trying to impress him. She didn't know who he was. She didn't care about his money. But in 30 seconds, she was about to destroy everything he thought he knew about love. Because what happened next would force him to choose between his perfect life and the one person who could save him from himself. But first, his grandfather whispered something that changed everything. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Daniel Crawford adjusted his Italian silk tie for the third time in 10 minutes. At 34, he had built an empire from nothing. Tech innovations that revolutionized how people connected, investments that turned millions into hundreds of millions, and a reputation that made him one of the most eligible bachelors on the West Coast. He was also, by his own meticulous count, about to reject his 54th woman. Mr. Crawford, the hostess at Le Bernardin, approached with practiced elegance. "Your table is ready." Daniel nodded curtly, checking his Patek Philippe watch. Punctuality was one of his non-negotiables. If Victoria Hartwell, the senator's daughter and Stanford law graduate, couldn't manage to arrive on time, she'd already failed his first test. She arrived at 7:47 p.m. He'd reserved the table for 7:30. Victoria was everything his assistant had promised. Blonde, statuesque, with the kind of poise that came from cotillion classes and charity galas. She was perfectly acceptable. She was also perfectly wrong. By 9:15, Daniel had mentally composed his polite dismissal. By 9:30, he was calculating how long he needed to wait before making his exit without appearing completely rude. By 9:45, Victoria was discussing her preference for winter weddings and how 4 children seemed like the right number for a family of our stature. "I'm sorry," Daniel interrupted, placing his napkin on the table. "I need to take this call." His phone hadn't rang. He stepped outside into the crisp San Francisco evening, breathing in the fog-tinged air. 53 women. 53 carefully vetted, highly accomplished, socially appropriate women. Doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, women who looked perfect on paper and felt like cardboard in person. His phone buzzed, this time for real. "Daniel?" The voice was shaky, older. "It's your grandfather." Daniel's blood chilled. Harold Crawford didn't call, ever. In Daniel's 34 years, his grandfather had picked up the phone exactly twice. Once when Daniel's parents died in the accident, and once when Daniel's first company went public. "Grandpa, what's wrong?" I'm at Presbyterian Hospital, room 314. The doctors say," Harold's voice broke. "They say it's time, son. I was hoping, could you come?" Daniel was already moving toward his car. "I'm on my way." The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of red lights and racing thoughts. Harold Crawford had raised him after the accident, a gruff but loving man who'd built his own modest construction company from nothing. While Daniel had surpassed his grandfather's financial success by every measure, he'd never surpassed the old man's integrity, his genuine warmth, his ability to make everyone around him feel valued. The hospital's sterile corridors felt like a maze. Daniel's expensive shoes clicked against the linoleum as he navigated toward the cardiac wing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd been so busy building his empire, so focused on finding the perfect woman to complete his perfect life, that he'd barely seen his grandfather in months. Room 314 was dimly lit, filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the whispered conversations of medical staff. He pushed through the door and stopped short. His grandfather lay propped up in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen him. But that wasn't what made Daniel freeze. It was the woman sitting beside the bed, holding Harold's weathered hand in both of hers. She was young, maybe late 20s, with rich brown skin and kind eyes that seemed to hold depths Daniel had never encountered. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore navy scrubs that had seen better days. There was nothing glamorous about her, nothing that would have made her stand out in the circles Daniel traveled in.
But as Daniel watched, she leaned forward and said something that made Harold's eyes light up, actually light up with genuine joy. For the first time in what felt like hours, his grandfather smiled. "And then," she was saying, her voice warm and musical, "the rooster looked at me like I was the crazy one. Can you believe that? Me, crazy, when he's the one who thinks he owns the entire neighborhood?" Harold chuckled, actually chuckled, despite the oxygen cannula in his nose. "Reminds me of my neighbor's rooster back in Arkansas. Meanest bird you ever saw, but he protected those hens like they were precious gems." "Now that's a rooster with priorities," she said, squeezing Harold's hand gently. "Just like someone else I know who spent 40 years making sure everyone around him felt protected and loved." Daniel felt something crack open in his chest. When was the last time he'd seen his grandfather smile like that? When was the last time he'd made anyone smile like that? The woman looked up and noticed Daniel standing in the doorway. Instead of the flustered reaction he was used to, the sudden awareness of his wealth, his status, his eligibility as a business connection, she simply smiled. "You must be Daniel," she said, rising from her chair. "I'm Ruby Johnson. I've been taking care of your grandfather tonight." Taking care of him? The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd taken care of anyone? When was the last time anyone had taken care of him? Not his money, not his status, not his potential as a business connection, but actually him. "He's been telling me all about you," Ruby continued, and Daniel braced himself for the usual litany of his accomplishments. "About how you used to help him in his workshop when you were little. How you'd spend hours asking him to explain how everything worked. He's so proud of the man you've become." Not the empire he'd built, not the money he'd made, the man he'd become. Daniel moved closer to the bed, and Harold's eyes focused on him with effort. "Danny boy," his grandfather whispered, using the nickname he hadn't heard in years. "You made it." "Of course I made it, Grandpa. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. You're here now. That's what matters."
Ruby quietly moved to check the monitors, giving them space while remaining close enough to help if needed. Daniel watched her efficient, gentle movements, the way she adjusted Harold's blanket without being asked, the way she seemed to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. "She's special, this one," Harold murmured, following Daniel's gaze. "Been here all evening, even though her shift ended hours ago. Says she doesn't like goodbyes." Daniel looked at Ruby with new eyes. She was beautiful, he realized, but not in the way he'd been trained to recognize. Her beauty was in the careful way she smoothed Harold's blanket, in the patience with which she listened to his stories, in the genuine warmth that seemed to radiate from her very being. "Ruby," Daniel said, and she looked up from adjusting the IV line. "Thank you for being here, for taking care of him." She smiled, and Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in any of his 53 carefully orchestrated dates. "It's my privilege," she said simply. "Your grandfather is remarkable. He's been telling me about the treehouse he built for you when you were 8, and the time you two drove to Arizona just to see the Grand Canyon." Daniel remembered. It had been the summer after his parents died, when grief had made him mute and angry. Harold had simply packed a bag, loaded Daniel into his pickup truck, and driven west without explanation. They'd spent 3 days camping under the stars, and by the time they returned home, Daniel had started talking again. "He saved my life," Daniel said quietly, surprising himself with his honesty. "He told me," Ruby said, gently. "He also told me how you saved his, how you made sure he could retire with dignity, how you bought him that little house with the garden he'd always wanted." Daniel had forgotten about that.
It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, ensuring his grandfather's comfort, making sure he never had to worry about money again. But the way Ruby said it, with such warmth and admiration, made it sound like something meaningful. Harold's breathing grew more labored, and Ruby was instantly at his side, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency while maintaining her gentle touch. "Are you in pain, Mr. Crawford?" she asked softly. He had heard you ask in a quieter voice. "Mr. Crawford, are you in pain?" Harold shook his head slightly. "Just tired," he whispered. "So tired." Ruby nodded, understanding. "Would you like me to call the chaplain, or would you prefer some quiet time with your grandson?" "Stay," Harold said, his voice barely audible. "Please, both of you." So they stayed. Ruby in her chair beside the bed, Daniel standing awkwardly at the foot, watching as this woman he'd known for less than an hour provided comfort with a skill that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. As the night wore on, Daniel found himself studying Ruby's face in the dim light. There was something indefinable about her, a peace, a groundedness that he'd never encountered in his rarefied world. She wasn't trying to impress him or capture his attention. She was simply present, fully there, focused entirely on providing comfort to a dying man. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen.
As the hours passed, Daniel found himself drawn into a world he'd never experienced. Ruby moved through her duties with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years of practice, but it was the way she connected with Harold that left Daniel speechless. "Tell me about the workshop," Ruby said, settling back into her chair as Harold's breathing steadied. "Daniel mentioned you taught him everything about building." Harold's eyes brightened despite his weakness. "That boy, he has such curious hands, always taking things apart, trying to understand how they worked. I'd find him in the garage with my tools scattered everywhere, completely absorbed." "Sounds like someone I know," Ruby said with a gentle smile. "My nephew's the same way. Last week he dismantled my coffee maker to improve it. Took me 3 hours to put it back together." Daniel watched this exchange with growing amazement. In 30 minutes, Ruby had learned more about his childhood than his last 3 dates combined had bothered to ask about. She wasn't gathering information to impress him or find an angle. She was simply listening, genuinely interested in Harold's stories. "Ruby," Harold's voice was growing weaker, "tell me about your family. Do you have children?" A shadow crossed Ruby's features, so brief Daniel almost missed it. "Not yet," she said softly, "but I have 3 nephews who keep me busy, and about 24 patients who've adopted me as their honorary granddaughter." "Good, good. Family's not just blood, you know? It's who shows up." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Who shows up? When had he last shown up for anyone without an agenda? When had he last sat with someone simply because they needed company? "Mr. Crawford, would you like some water? Or maybe some ice chips?" "Please," Harold whispered.
Ruby rose and moved to the small kitchenette, and Daniel found himself following her. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders carried the weight of caring for people in their darkest moments. "How long have you been here?" he asked quietly. "Since about 3 this afternoon," Ruby said, filling a cup with ice chips. "I was supposed to leave at 7, but..." She shrugged. "He needed someone." "But you don't even know him." Ruby looked at him with those warm, deep eyes. "I know enough. I know he raised an incredible man after losing his son. I know he built houses for families who couldn't afford them. I know he's scared of dying alone." She paused, her voice growing softer. "I know he's been waiting for you to come home." Daniel felt something crack open in his chest. "Come home?" "He talks about you constantly. Not about your business or your money. About you.
about how proud he is of your kindness, your integrity, about how he wishes he could see you settle down with someone who truly loves you." "He said that?" Ruby nodded, returning to Harold's bedside. "He said you've been looking for love in all the wrong places, that you've forgotten what it actually looks like." Daniel stood frozen as Ruby helped Harold with the ice chips, her touch gentle and patient. Every movement was an act of service, of pure compassion. There was no performance here, no angle, no agenda, just one human being caring for another. "Danny," Harold called weakly, "come here, son." Daniel approached the bed, and Harold reached out with a trembling hand. When Daniel took it, he was shocked by how frail his grandfather had become. "I need to tell you something. About love. About what matters." "Grandpa, you should rest." "No." Harold's grip tightened with surprising strength. "Listen to me. I've watched you for months, dating all those women. Pretty girls, smart girls, accomplished girls. But Danny, you've been looking for a resume, not a heart." Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks, acutely aware of Ruby's presence. "I just want someone compatible." "Compatible?" Harold's laugh was weak but genuine. "Son, your grandmother and I were about as incompatible as two people could be. She was a city girl who loved opera and fancy restaurants. I was a country boy who preferred fishin' and campin'. But you know what we had?" Daniel shook his head. "We saw each other, really saw each other. She saw past my rough edges to the man I was trying to become. I saw past her fancy ways to the woman who'd sit up all night with a sick neighbor, who'd give her last dollar to help a struggling family." Harold's eyes found Ruby, who was pretending not to listen while checking his monitors. "Love isn't about finding someone who fits your list, Danny. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be better than you are." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitors. Daniel felt the weight of his grandfather's words, the weight of all those failed dates, all those missed connections. He'd been so focused on finding the perfect woman that he'd never stopped to ask if he was becoming the right man. "Ruby," Harold called softly, and she moved closer. "Would you mind giving us just a moment?" "Of course," she said, moving toward the door, but Harold stopped her. "Actually, no. Stay, please." He looked between Daniel and Ruby with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "I want to tell you both something about my Emily." Daniel had heard stories about his grandmother his entire life, but something in Harold's voice suggested this would be different. "I met her in a hospital. Not as a patient. I was visiting my buddy who'd been in an accident. Emily was his nurse. I was this rough construction worker, covered in sawdust and probably smelling like turpentine. She was this elegant woman who spoke 3 languages and had more education than half the men I knew." Ruby had moved closer, drawn into the story despite herself. "I thought she was way out of my league," Harold continued. "But there was something about the way she cared for people. She made my friend feel like he mattered, like he was worth her time and attention. She didn't just treat his injuries, she treated his fear, his loneliness, his worry about his family." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at Ruby, who was listening with complete attention. "I started visiting every day, not to see my friend, to see her. To watch her work, to see what real compassion looked like. And one day she asked me why I kept coming. And I told her the truth, that I'd never met anyone like her, someone who could make people feel safe just by being present." The parallel was unmistakable. Daniel felt his heart racing as Harold continued.
She said I was crazy, that we had nothing in common, that it would never work. But I knew something she didn't. I knew that love isn't about having everything in common. It's about admiring who someone is at their core. What do you think matters most in finding true love? Compatibility on paper or recognizing someone's character in action? Let me know your thoughts below. Harold's breathing grew more labored, and Ruby immediately moved to his side, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. His oxygen levels are dropping, she said quietly to Daniel. This is normal, but what? Ruby's professional composure cracked slightly. It means we don't have much time. Daniel felt the world tilt around him. Grandpa? Harold's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Daniel with effort. Danny, the ring. What ring? In my jacket pocket. Your grandmother's engagement ring. I've been waiting for you to find the right woman. Daniel's hands shook as he reached into Harold's jacket, hanging in the small closet. The ring was exactly as he remembered from childhood, a simple solitaire on a worn gold band, nothing flashy, nothing ostentatious, just a symbol of a love that had lasted 53 years. Grandpa, I haven't found... Haven't you? Harold's eyes moved meaningfully toward Ruby, who was adjusting his oxygen flow with gentle hands. Daniel looked at Ruby, really looked at her. Her hair was escaping from its ponytail after a 12-hour shift. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her face free of makeup. By every standard he'd been judging women, she was completely ordinary. But as he watched her work, Daniel saw something extraordinary. He saw someone who had chosen to stay past her shift to comfort a dying man. Someone who listened to stories with genuine interest, who treated everyone with dignity regardless of their status. Someone who made his grandfather, a man who'd grown increasingly isolated in recent years, smile and laugh in his final hours. Ruby, Harold called weakly, and she moved closer. Would you hold my hand? Of course, she said, taking Harold's weathered hand in both of hers. I want to tell you something about Danny. He's not just any millionaire. He's the kind of man who spent every weekend of his teenage years helping me build houses for Habitat for Humanity. The kind of man who still calls me every Sunday, even when he's traveling. The kind of man who's been taking care of me for years, making sure I never have to worry about anything. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He never thought of those things as special. They were just what you did for family. The problem is, Harold continued, he's been so busy building his empire that he's forgotten how to build a home. He's been looking for a woman who can fit into his life instead of looking for someone he'd want to build a life with. Ruby's eyes met Daniel's across the hospital bed, and he saw something there, understanding maybe, or recognition. Not the calculating look he was used to from women who'd discovered his wealth, but something warmer, more genuine. Harold, Ruby said softly, you're a remarkable man, and you've raised a remarkable grandson. Anyone would be lucky to have either of you in their life. Even someone like him? Harold asked, his voice barely audible. Even someone who's probably made every mistake a man can make when it comes to love? Ruby's smile was gentle but certain. Especially someone like him. The fact that he's here, that he dropped everything to be with you, that tells me everything I need to know about who he really is. Daniel felt something break open in his chest. For the first time in his adult life, someone was seeing him. Not his bank account, not his business success, not his potential as a provider or status symbol. Ruby was seeing the man Harold had raised, the man he'd been before wealth and success had built walls around his heart. Ruby, Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion, I need to ask you something. She looked up at him with those warm, patient eyes. Why did you stay tonight? You could have gone home hours ago. You don't know us. We're not your family.
Ruby was quiet for a long moment, her thumb gently stroking Harold's hand. "Because," she said finally, "everyone deserves to be loved in their final moments. Everyone deserves to know they mattered, that their life had meaning. And Harold has spent his whole life making other people feel valuable. The least I could do was make sure he felt valued too." Daniel stared at her, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. In 53 dates, no woman had ever said anything that revealed such depth of character, such genuine compassion. Ruby wasn't trying to impress him or win his approval. She was simply being who she was, someone who showed up for people when they needed it most. "Besides," Ruby added with a small smile, "I've learned some of the best stories tonight. Did you know your grandfather once drove 15 hours straight to help a friend move? Or that he taught himself to knit so he could make blankets for premature babies at the hospital?" Daniel didn't know those things. He'd been so focused on his own life, his own success, that he missed the quiet heroism of the man who'd raised him. "He's proud of you," Ruby continued, "but I think he's worried that you're so focused on building something impressive that you're forgetting to build something meaningful." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. How many meaningful relationships had he sacrificed for success? How many opportunities for genuine connection had he missed while pursuing the perfect woman on paper? Harold's breathing grew more shallow, and Ruby immediately checked his vitals again. "His heart rate is slowing," she said gently. This is normal for this stage." "What do I do?" Daniel asked, panic creeping into his voice. "Just be here," Ruby said softly. "Let him know he's loved. Let him know he's not alone." Daniel moved closer to the bed, taking his grandfather's other hand. "I'm here, Grandpa. I'm not going anywhere." Harold's eyes opened one more time, focusing on Daniel with clarity that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his failing body. "Danny, the ring. I have it, Grandpa." "Good. When you find her, when you find the one who makes you want to be better, you'll know." Harold's eyes moved to Ruby. "You'll know, because she'll see you, really see you, not what you have, not what you've built, but who you are." Daniel looked at Ruby, who was watching Harold with tears in her eyes. She wasn't crying for a stranger. She was crying for a man who'd become important to her in the space of a few hours. A man she'd never see again, whose story she'd carry with her long after tonight was over. "Harold," Ruby whispered, "thank you. Thank you for sharing your stories with me. Thank you for raising such a good man. Thank you for showing me what love looks like." Harold smiled, actually smiled despite his labored breathing. "Thank you, dear girl. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for proving that there are still people in this world who care more than themselves." Daniel felt tears streaming down his face. He'd spent years searching for love, never realizing that it had been right in front of him all along in the form of his grandfather's unconditional care. And now in this hospital room, he was witnessing it again in the form of a woman who'd given her whole heart to a dying stranger. "Ruby," Daniel said, his voice breaking. She looked up at him, and Daniel saw his own tears reflected in her eyes. "I need you to know something," he said. "What you've done tonight, who you are, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Ruby's breath caught, and for a moment, the space between them felt charged with possibility. But then Harold's hand squeezed Daniel's with surprising strength. "Danny," Harold whispered, "tell her." "Tell her what?" "Tell her how you feel. Tell her what she means to you. Don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't wait until it's too late to say what matters." Daniel looked at Ruby, this extraordinary woman who'd entered his life just hours ago and already changed everything. He thought about the 53 women he'd dismissed, the carefully constructed lists of requirements, the endless search for perfection. None of it mattered. None of it had ever mattered. What mattered was this: the way Ruby had stayed past her shift to comfort a dying man, the way she listened to Harold's stories with genuine interest, the way she'd made her grandfather smile in his final hours, the way she'd shown Daniel what love actually looked like, not a transaction or a conquest, but a choice to see the best in someone and nurture it. "Ruby," Daniel said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I need you to know something." She looked up at him with those warm, patient eyes, and Daniel felt the last of his walls crumble. I've been searching for love in all the wrong places. I've been looking for someone who could fit into my life instead of looking for someone I'd want to build a life with. I've been so focused on finding the perfect woman that I forgot to ask if I was becoming the right man. Ruby's breath caught, but she didn't speak. Tonight, Daniel continued, watching you with my grandfather, seeing the way you care for people, it's shown me what I've been missing. You're not trying to impress me or win my approval. You're just being who you are. Someone who shows up for people when they need it most. Someone who makes the world better just by being in it. Daniel knelt beside Ruby's chair, Harold's grandmother's ring burning in his pocket. But this wasn't about the ring, or about marriage, or any of the traditional expectations he'd been carrying. This was about truth. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if you could ever feel the same way about me. I don't even know if I deserve someone like you in my life. But I know this. You've shown me what love looks like, real love, and I want to spend the rest of my life learning how to love like that. Ruby's eyes filled with tears and she reached out to touch Daniel's face with gentle fingers. "Daniel," she whispered, Harold's hand went limp in Daniel's grip. The world stopped. The silence in room 314 was absolute. Daniel stared at Harold's still form, his grandfather's hand growing cold in his grip. The monitors had fallen silent, their steady rhythm replaced by a flat, endless tone that seemed to echo through Daniel's chest. "No, no, no, Grandpa, please." Ruby moved with professional efficiency, checking Harold's pulse, his breathing, though he knew. She reached over and silently turned off the monitors, returning the room to a peace that felt anything but peaceful. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, her voice thick with tears. "He's gone."
Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Harold had been the one constant in his life, the anchor that had kept him grounded even as success threatened to sweep him away from everything that mattered. And now he was gone, taking with him 53 years of wisdom, love, and the kind of unconditional acceptance Daniel had never found anywhere else. "I should have been here sooner," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I should have come weeks ago, months ago. I should have—" "Daniel," Ruby's hand covered his, warm and steady. "You were here when it mattered. He knew you loved him. He felt it. But I was too late. I spent all that time on meaningless dates, chasing after women who didn't matter, and I missed so much time with him." Ruby was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of his hand. "He told me something earlier," she said finally. "He said you called him every Sunday without fail. He said you never forgot his birthday, never missed sending him flowers on the anniversary of your grandmother's death. He said you bought him that house not because he asked, but because you noticed he was getting tired of apartment living." Daniel looked up at her through his tears. "How do you remember all that?" "Because it mattered to him. Because every story he told about you was filled with so much love and pride that it was impossible not to remember." Ruby's own tears fell freely now. "You didn't fail him, Daniel. You gave him a life full of meaning. You were his greatest accomplishment." The words should have been comforting, but they only made the loss feel more acute. Daniel had spent years trying to prove himself worthy of Harold's love, never realizing he'd already had it unconditionally. Ruby stood and moved to the small window, giving Daniel space to say goodbye. But Daniel found himself watching her instead of Harold, noting the way her shoulders shook with silent sobs, the way she pressed her hand to the glass as if trying to ground herself. "Ruby," he said quietly, "you barely knew him. Why are you—" She turned, and Daniel saw grief written across her features as clearly as if Harold had been her own grandfather. "Because he became real to me tonight. Because in a few hours he shared more love and wisdom than some people experience in a lifetime. Because—" Her voice broke. "Because I've seen too many people die alone, And Harold didn't die alone. He died surrounded by love, and that matters more than you know." Daniel stood slowly, Harold's ring still clutched in his palm. The confession he'd been about to make felt surreal now, overshadowed by loss and the strange intimacy of shared grief. "What happens now?" he asked. Ruby wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, slipping back into her professional role like armor. "I'll need to call the doctor. There will be paperwork, arrangements to make. Do you have a funeral home in mind?" The practical questions felt like a slap. After the emotional intensity of the last few hours, the idea of reducing Harold's death to logistics seemed impossible. I don't know. I haven't thought about—" "It's okay," Ruby said gently. "You don't have to decide everything tonight. I can help you with the immediate steps." There was something different in her voice now, a professional distance that hadn't been there before. Daniel felt a stab of panic. Was she pulling away? Had his confession been too much, too soon? Had he misread everything that had passed between them? "Ruby," he said, stepping closer. "What I said earlier, before my grandfather—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Ruby looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of sadness. "Daniel, you just lost the most important person in your life. You're grieving. Everything feels heightened right now, more intense than it really is." "That's not what this is," Daniel said, though doubt crept into his voice. Was it? Had he only imagined the connection between them, projected meaning onto what was simply a nurse doing her job with exceptional compassion? "You don't know me," Ruby continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You know what you've seen tonight, but that's not real life. That's a crisis situation where everyone's emotions are running high." "So you're saying everything I felt tonight was just, what, grief? Confusion?" Her composure cracked slightly. "I'm saying you're a millionaire who could have any woman he wants, and I'm a nurse who works double shifts to pay off student loans. I'm saying that in a few days, when you're back in your world of fancy restaurants and accomplished women, tonight will feel like a dream." "You think this is about money?" Daniel's voice was sharper than he intended. "You think I'm slumming it in, testing out the help?" "I think you're a good man who's been deeply affected by loss, and I think grief can make people feel things that aren't sustainable in daylight." The words stung because part of Daniel wondered if she was right. Had he been so moved by watching her care for Harold that he confused admiration with love? Was this the emotional equivalent of a rebound, seeking comfort in the first person who'd shown him genuine kindness? But then he remembered the way she'd looked at him when Harold was telling his stories, the way she'd seen past his wealth to the man underneath, the way she'd made him want to be better than he was. "What if you're wrong?" he asked. "What if what I feel is real?" Ruby's breath caught, and for a moment Daniel saw something flicker in her eyes, hope, maybe, or longing. But then she shook her head. "Daniel, I've been a nurse for 6 years. I've seen grief do incredible things to people. I've seen patients fall in love with doctors, families become convinced that staff are angels sent from heaven. Strong emotions in extreme situations create bonds that feel unbreakable in the moment, but don't survive ordinary life." "Is that what you think this is? A grief reaction?" "I think—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think you're someone who's been searching for authentic connection, and tonight you saw what that looked like. But that doesn't mean I'm the person you've been searching for. It might just mean I was here at the right moment to show you what's possible." Daniel felt the truth of her words, even as they broke something inside him. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was confusing witness with destination, mistaking the lesson for the teacher. But then he thought about the 53 women he'd rejected, women who on paper should have been perfect for him. None of them had made him feel what he felt watching her care for Harold. None of them had made him want to be worthy of their love. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. Ruby nodded. "When you looked at me tonight, what did you see?"
Ruby was quiet for so long that Daniel thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw someone who loves deeply but has forgotten how to let himself be loved. I saw someone who's been so focused on finding the right person that he's lost track of being the right person. I saw—" She paused, tears filling her eyes again. "I saw someone who reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place." "What do you mean?" "I became a nurse because I wanted to matter. I wanted to be the person who showed up when people needed it most. But somewhere along the way, it became just a job. Patients became cases. Families became logistics to manage. I'd forgotten what it felt like to really connect with someone, to have my presence actually matter." Ruby moved closer to Harold's bed, smoothing his blanket one final time. "Tonight, watching you with your grandfather, seeing how much you loved him, it reminded me that what I do isn't just about medical care. It's about human connection. It's about making sure people know they matter." Daniel felt his heart racing. "So you helped me remember something important?" "Yes." "Then why can't you believe that you helped me remember something too?" Ruby looked at him with eyes full of pain and longing. "Because what you remembered might be about me, but what I remembered was about myself. There's a difference." The distinction hit Daniel like a physical blow. Was she right? Had he fallen in love with Ruby, or had he fallen in love with who he became when he was around her? Before he could answer, there was a soft knock on the door. Dr. Martinez entered, his expression solemn. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said to Daniel. "Ruby called me. I know this is difficult, but there are some things we need to discuss." The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and procedures. Ruby assisted with quiet efficiency, but Daniel noticed the way she'd pulled back, maintaining professional distance. When families needed to be called, when arrangements needed to be discussed, she was helpful but detached. It wasn't until the funeral director arrived that Daniel realized how alone he was. Harold had been his only family, the last connection to his parents, to his childhood, to the man he'd been before success had complicated everything. "Mr. Crawford," the funeral director was a kind-faced woman in her 50s. "Do you have other family who should be involved in these decisions?" "No," Daniel said quietly. "It's just me." Ruby looked up from her chart notes, and Daniel saw something flicker across her face. Sympathy, maybe? Or recognition? She knew about being alone, he realized. About being the one who showed up because there was no one else. "Mr. Crawford," the funeral director continued, "your grandfather left some specific instructions. He prepaid for everything and left a letter with his preferences. He said to tell you that he didn't want you to have to make difficult decisions while grieving." Even in death, Harold was taking care of him. Daniel felt tears threaten again. "There's one other thing," the funeral director said. "He requested that, if possible, Ruby Johnson be invited to the service. He said she'd become important to him in his final hours." Daniel looked at Ruby, who seemed as surprised as he was. That's very kind," Ruby said softly. "I'd be honored." "The service will be Thursday at 2 p.m. at Sunset Memorial Chapel." After she left, Daniel found himself alone with Ruby again. The room felt different now, charged with unspoken questions and the weight of what lay ahead. "You don't have to come," Daniel said. "I know you didn't really know him." "I knew him," Ruby said firmly. "Maybe not for long, but I knew him, and he knew me. That matters." "Daniel," he stepped closer. "Ruby, what happens after Thursday? Do I never see you again?" Ruby's composure finally cracked completely. "I don't know. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to separate what happened tonight from what might happen tomorrow. I don't know if what we felt was real or just
Just two people finding comfort in a terrible moment. Then don't separate it, Daniel said. Don't analyze it. Just be open to the possibility that maybe for once in both our lives, we found exactly what we needed exactly when we needed it. Ruby looked at him with tears streaming down her face. And what if we're wrong? What if this destroys both of us? What if we're right? Daniel countered. What if this saves both of us? Before Ruby could answer, there was a soft knock on the door. Dr. Martinez entered, his expression solemn. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said to Daniel. "Ruby called me. I know this is difficult, but there are some things we need to discuss." The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and procedures. Ruby assisted with quiet efficiency, but Daniel noticed the way she'd pulled back, maintaining professional distance. When families needed to be called, when arrangements needed to be discussed, she was helpful but detached. It wasn't until the funeral director arrived that Daniel realized how alone he was. Harold had been his only family, the last connection to his parents, to his childhood, to the man he'd been before success had complicated everything. Mr. Crawford, the funeral director, was a kind-faced woman in her 50s. "Do you have other family who should be involved in these decisions?" "No," Daniel said quietly. "It's just me." Ruby looked up from her chart notes, and Daniel saw something flicker across her face. Sympathy, maybe? Or recognition? She knew about being alone, he realized. About being the one who showed up because there was no one else. "Mr. Crawford," the funeral director continued, "your grandfather left some specific instructions. He prepaid for everything and left a letter with his preferences. He said to tell you that he didn't want you to have to make difficult decisions while grieving." Even in death, Harold was taking care of him. Daniel felt tears threaten again. "There's one other thing," the funeral director said. "He requested that, if possible, Ruby Johnson be invited to the service. He said she'd become important to him in his final hours." Daniel looked at Ruby, who seemed as surprised as he was. That's very kind," Ruby said softly. "I'd be honored." "The service will be Thursday at 2 p.m. at Sunset Memorial Chapel." After she left, Daniel found himself alone with Ruby again. The room felt different now, charged with unspoken questions and the weight of what lay ahead. "You don't have to come," Daniel said. "I know you didn't really know him." "I knew him," Ruby said firmly. "Maybe not for long, but I knew him, and he knew me. That matters." "Daniel," he stepped closer. "Ruby, what happens after Thursday? Do I never see you again?" Ruby's composure finally cracked completely. "I don't know. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to separate what happened tonight from what might happen tomorrow. I don't know if what we felt was real or just two people finding comfort in a terrible moment." "Then don't separate it," Daniel said. "Don't analyze it. Just be open to the possibility that maybe for once in both our lives we found exactly what we needed exactly when we needed it." Ruby looked at him with tears streaming down her face. "And what if we're wrong? What if this destroys both of us?" "What if we're right?" Daniel countered. "What if this saves both of us?" Before Ruby could answer, there was a soft knock on the door. Dr. Martinez entered, his expression solemn. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said to Daniel. "Ruby called me. I know this is difficult, but there are some things we need to discuss." The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and procedures. Ruby assisted with quiet efficiency, but Daniel noticed the way she'd pulled back, maintaining professional distance. When families needed to be called, when arrangements needed to be discussed, she was helpful but detached. It wasn't until the funeral director arrived that Daniel realized how alone he was. Harold had been his only family, the last connection to his parents, to his childhood, to the man he'd been before success had complicated everything. "Mr. Crawford," the funeral director was a kind-faced woman in her 50s. "Do you have other family who should be involved in these decisions?" "No," Daniel said quietly. "It's just me." Ruby looked up from her chart notes, and Daniel saw something flicker across her face. Sympathy, maybe? Or recognition? She knew about being alone, he realized. About being the one who showed up because there was no one else. Mr. Crawford, the funeral director continued, your grandfather left some specific instructions. He prepaid for everything and left a letter with his preferences. He said to tell you that he didn't want you to have to make difficult decisions while grieving. Even in death, Harold was taking care of him. Daniel felt tears threaten again. There's one other thing, the funeral director said. He requested that, if possible, Ruby Johnson be invited to the service. He said she'd become important to him in his final hours. Daniel looked at Ruby, who seemed as surprised as he was. That's very kind, Ruby said softly. I'd be honored. The service will be Thursday at 2 p.m. at Sunset Memorial Chapel. After she left, Daniel found himself alone with Ruby again. The room felt different now, charged with unspoken questions and the weight of what lay ahead. You don't have to come, Daniel said. I know you didn't really know him.
He hadn't heard from Ruby since that night. Not a call, not a text, nothing. Part of him wondered if she'd changed her mind about coming to the service. Part of him wondered if that would be easier for both of them. The funeral home was exactly what Harold would have wanted. Understated, warm, with natural wood and soft lighting that made the space feel more like a living room than a place of mourning. Daniel had arrived early, needing time to compose himself before facing the handful of people Harold had touched over his 78 years. The guests were exactly who Daniel had expected. Harold's former construction crew, now gray-haired and slower, but still bearing the weathered hands of men who'd built things that lasted. Mrs. Chen from next door, who Harold had helped with her garden for 15 years. Father Murphy from St. Mary's, where Harold had attended Mass every Sunday, despite his questions about organized religion. The small congregation of people who'd known Harold not as someone important, but as someone good. Daniel moved through the receiving line on autopilot, accepting condolences and sharing memories, but his attention kept drifting to the entrance. Would Ruby come? And if she did, what would it mean? At 1:55 p.m., Daniel had his answer. Ruby entered quietly, wearing a simple black dress that somehow made her look more beautiful than any of the designer gowns he'd seen on his 53 failed dates. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and she moved with the same quiet grace he remembered from the hospital. Their eyes met across the room, and Daniel felt the same jolt of recognition he'd experienced that first night. Whatever had passed between them in room 314, it wasn't diminished by daylight or distance. If anything, seeing her in this context, choosing to be here for Harold, for him, made it feel more real, not less. Ruby approached slowly, navigating through the other mourners until she stood before him. "Daniel," she said softly, "how are you holding up?" "Better now," he said, surprising himself with his honesty. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I told you I would," Ruby said simply. "I don't break my promises." Before Daniel could respond, Father Murphy stepped to the podium and called for everyone to take their seats. Ruby moved toward the back, but Daniel caught her arm gently. "Sit with me. Please, Harold would have wanted that." Ruby hesitated for a moment, then nodded. They moved to the front row together, and Daniel was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the subtle scent of her perfume, the way she folded her hands in her lap, and the careful space she maintained between them. Father Murphy's eulogy was everything Harold would have appreciated: honest, warm, focused on the man's character rather than his achievements. He spoke about Harold's quiet generosity, his willingness to help anyone who needed it, his devotion to the memory of his wife, Emily. Harold Crawford was not a man who sought recognition. He was a man who sought to serve. He measured his success not in dollars accumulated, but in lives touched, not in status achieved, but in love given freely. Daniel felt Ruby's hand brush his as she reached for a tissue, and without thinking, he took her hand in his. She didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed gently, offering comfort in the simple gesture. Harold's greatest pride, Father Murphy continued, was his grandson Daniel. He spoke often about the man Daniel had become. Successful, yes, but more importantly, kind. Harold's only worry was that Daniel was so focused on building a business that he might forget to build a life. Daniel felt the words like a physical blow. Even in death, Harold was still trying to teach him, still trying to guide him toward what mattered. When it came time for Daniel to speak, he approached the podium with trembling hands. The small congregation looked up at him expectantly, and for a moment his mind went completely blank. Then he saw Ruby in the front row, her eyes warm and encouraging, and the words came. My grandfather, Harold Crawford, saved my life twice. The first time I was 8 years old, and I'd just lost my parents. I was angry and scared and convinced that the world was a cruel place that took away everyone you loved. Harold took me in, and more than that, he showed me that love doesn't disappear when people die. It lives on in how we choose to treat others. Daniel paused, looking directly at Ruby. The second time he saved my life was 3 nights ago, in room 314 at Presbyterian Hospital. I thought I was there to say goodbye to him, but really he was giving me one final gift. He was showing me what love looks like. Ruby's breath caught audibly, and Daniel saw tears gathering in her eyes. My grandfather spent his life building things that would last. Houses, relationships, a legacy of kindness. He taught me that the most important thing you can build isn't a business or a fortune. It's a life that matters to other people. A life that makes the world a little bit better. Daniel's voice broke slightly. He also taught me that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be perfect for them. Someone who sees who you really are and loves you anyway. Someone who shows up when it matters most. He looked directly at Ruby again. He showed me that it's possible to know someone's heart in a single moment if you're paying attention, and that sometimes the person you've been searching for your entire life walks into your world exactly when you need them most. Ruby was crying openly now, and Daniel felt his own tears falling. Harold Crawford lived 78 years of love and service and quiet heroism. The best way I can honor his memory is to try to live like he did, with an open heart, ready hands, and faith that love always finds a way. As Daniel returned to his seat, Ruby reached for his hand again, this time holding on like she was anchoring herself. The rest of the service passed in the blur of hymns and prayers. When it was over, people lingered, sharing stories and offering final condolences. Ruby stayed by his side, not saying much but providing steady, quiet support. As the crowd thinned, Mrs. Chen approached them. "You must be Ruby," she said with a warm smile. "Harold told me all about you when I visited him in the hospital. He said you were special." Ruby looked surprised. "He mentioned me?" "Oh, honey, he couldn't stop talking about you. Said you reminded him of his Emily, all heart and kindness." Mrs. Chen patted Ruby's arm. "He also said his grandson was falling in love with you and was too stubborn to admit it." Daniel felt heat flood his cheeks, but Ruby just smiled gently. Harold was a wise man. That he was, and he had good instincts about people.
If he saw something between you two, I'd trust his judgment."
After Mrs. Chen left, Daniel and Ruby found themselves alone in the now empty chapel. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words and unresolved questions. "Your eulogy was beautiful," Ruby said finally. "I meant every word," Daniel said, "especially the part about love finding a way." Ruby looked at him with eyes full of pain and longing. "Daniel." "I know what you're going to say," Daniel interrupted, "that it's too soon, too complicated, too unlikely, that I'm a grieving millionaire and you're a practical nurse, and this is all just emotions running high." "Isn't it?" Ruby asked quietly. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, looking around the chapel where they'd just said goodbye to the man who'd shaped his entire understanding of love and character. "3 days ago, I would have said yes," Daniel said finally. 3 days ago, I was ready to dismiss what I felt as grief or gratitude or some kind of crisis bonding. But you know what I've realized? Ruby waited, her eyes never leaving his face. "I've realized that grief doesn't create feelings. It clarifies them. It strips away all the pretense and shows you what actually matters. And what matters to me, more than anything else in the world, is you." Ruby's breath caught. "Daniel." "I'm not asking you to marry me," Daniel said, moving closer. "I'm not asking you to fit into my world or change who you are or pretend to be someone you're not. I'm asking you to give us a chance to figure out what this is between us." "And what if it doesn't work?" Ruby whispered. "What if we try and it falls apart and we both get hurt?" Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out Harold's ring, his grandmother's simple solitaire that had symbolized 53 years of imperfect, beautiful, lasting love. "My grandfather gave this to me the night he died. It was my grandmother's engagement ring. He told me to give it to the woman who makes me want to be better than I am." Ruby stared at the ring, her eyes wide. "I'm not giving this to you now," Daniel said quickly. "This isn't a proposal. But I want you to know that in 53 years of marriage, my grandparents never had it easy. They fought, they struggled, they had to work at loving each other every single day. But they chose each other, over and over again, because they believed that what they had together was worth fighting for." Daniel closed the ring box and put it back in his pocket. "I'm asking you to fight for this with me, Ruby. Not because it will be easy, but because it might be worth it." Ruby was silent for so long that Daniel began to think he'd made a terrible mistake. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of everything. Of getting hurt, of hurting you, of this being as real as it feels and not being strong enough to handle it, of this being an illusion and losing something I never really had." Ruby's tears fell freely now. "I've never felt anything like what I felt that night with you and Harold. I've never met anyone who made me want to be braver, kinder, more myself than I already am." Daniel felt hope bloom in his chest. "Then why are we fighting this?" "Because," Ruby said, looking at him with eyes full of love and terror, "because falling in love with you would change everything about my life. And I'm not sure I'm brave enough for that kind of change." Daniel stepped closer, close enough to touch her face gently. "What if I told you that falling in love with you has already changed everything about my life, and that I've never been more grateful for anything in my entire existence?" Ruby closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "What if we mess this up?" "Then we mess it up together. But Ruby, what if we don't? What if this is exactly what Harold saw when he looked at us that night? What if this is exactly what he wanted for both of us?" Ruby opened her eyes, and Daniel saw something shift in their depths, a decision being made, fear being set aside in favor of possibility. "Okay," she whispered. Okay? Okay. Let's try. Let's figure out what this is between us. Let's see if what we felt that night can survive in daylight. Ruby's smile was tremulous but genuine. Let's see if a millionaire and a nurse can build something that matters. Daniel felt tears of relief and joy streaming down his face. Are you sure? No, Ruby said honestly. I'm scared. But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Daniel kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. It wasn't the desperate kiss of crisis or the passionate kiss of conquest. It was the gentle kiss of two people choosing each other, choosing hope, choosing to believe that love could find a way. When they broke apart, Ruby rested her forehead against his. So what now? She asked. Now, Daniel said, we start over, we do this right. I take you to dinner, not some fancy restaurant where I'm trying to impress you, but somewhere we can actually talk. We learn about each other. We figure out if what we have is strong enough to build on. I'd like that, Ruby said. And Ruby? Yes? Thank you for staying that night, for being there for Harold, for showing me what love looks like, for being brave enough to try this with me. Ruby's smile was radiant. Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me, for making me want to be braver. As they walked out of the chapel together, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in all his years of searching, peace. Not the restless satisfaction of conquest or achievement, but the deep, quiet peace that came from finding exactly where you belonged. Harold had been right. Love wasn't about finding someone who fit your list. It was about finding someone who made you want to throw the list away and build something entirely new. And as Daniel took Ruby's hand and helped her into his car, he knew they were about to build something beautiful. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the kitchen of his Nob Hill penthouse, attempting to flip pancakes with the same precision he applied to billion-dollar deals. The results were less than impressive. Need help? Ruby's voice came from behind him, warm with barely suppressed laughter. I've got this, Daniel said, just as a pancake landed half on the pan, half on the stovetop. This is exactly how I planned it. Of course it is, she said solemnly, taking the spatula from his hands. Very avant-garde. Harold would be proud of your artistic expression.
At the mention of his grandfather, Daniel smiled. In the months since the funeral, Harold's presence had become a source of comfort rather than pain. His wisdom guided them through the early, uncertain days of their relationship. His memory, a reminder of what they were building toward. Actually, Daniel said, wrapping his arms around Ruby from behind as she rescued the pancakes, I think Harold would be proud of more than just my cooking disasters. Ruby leaned back against his chest. Oh, really? What else? Daniel rested his chin on top of her head, looking out at the San Francisco skyline. So much had changed since that night in the hospital. Ruby had moved in 2 months ago. Not because of any grand romantic gesture, but because they'd simply stopped wanting to be apart. Her nursing schedule had proven surprisingly compatible with his business travel, and when they were both home, this space felt more like a home than it ever had when he'd lived here alone. I think he'd be proud that I finally learned the difference between building a life and building a lifestyle, Daniel said. It was true. The past 6 months had been a revelation. Daniel had discovered that love wasn't about adding someone to your existing life. It was about creating an entirely new life together. He'd restructured his business commitments to ensure he was home for dinner most nights. He'd started volunteering at the hospital where Ruby worked, reading to elderly patients who reminded him of Harold. He'd even learned to appreciate Ruby's tiny studio apartment in the Mission, where neighbors knew each other's names and borrowed sugar and argued about parking spaces with the passion of people who genuinely cared about their community. "Speaking of building," Ruby said, turning in his arms, "I have something to tell you." Daniel felt a flutter of nervousness. In 6 months, they'd navigated the complexities of merging two very different worlds with surprising grace, but he still sometimes worried that Ruby would wake up one day and decide that loving a millionaire was more complicated than it was worth. "Good something or concerning something?" he asked. "Good something, great something, actually." Ruby's smile was radiant. "Mrs. Chen called yesterday. She's finally ready to sell Harold's house." Daniel felt his heart skip. Harold's little house in the sunset, with its carefully tended garden and workshop full of hand tools, had been sitting empty since his death. Mrs. Chen, who held the key and checked on it weekly, had been waiting for the right moment to let Daniel know it was time to make a decision about the property. "And," Daniel prompted, "and I was thinking, maybe it's time for us to stop playing house in your penthouse and actually build a home somewhere." Daniel stared at her. They'd talked about the future in abstract terms, someday, eventually, when they were ready, but this felt concrete, real, like Ruby was saying she was ready to bet on forever. "You want to live in Harold's house?" he asked. "I want to live wherever you are," Ruby said simply. "But yes, I think Harold's house would be perfect. It needs a family, Daniel. It needs people who understand what he built there, what he meant it to represent." Daniel kissed her forehead, overwhelmed by the rightness of it. Harold would love that. "There's more," Ruby said, her smile growing mischievous. "Mrs. Chan also mentioned that Harold left something for you in the workshop, something he wanted you to find when you were ready to build something that matters." Daniel felt tears prick his eyes. Even 6 months later, Harold was still taking care of him, still guiding him toward what was important. "Ruby," Daniel said, his voice serious, "are you sure about this? About us? About building a life that's so different from what either of us planned?" Ruby reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "Daniel Crawford, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You want to know what I've learned in the past 6 months?" "What?" "I've learned that love isn't about finding someone who fits into your existing life. It's about creating an entirely new life together. I've learned that the best kind of love makes you braver, kinder, more yourself than you ever thought possible." Ruby's eyes were bright with tears and joy. "I've learned that sometimes the person you're meant to spend your life with walks into your world exactly when you need them most, in exactly the way you least expect it." I felt my throat tighten with emotion. Harold would say that love always finds a way. Ruby was a wise man, Ruby said softly, and he raised an incredible grandson. Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. 6 months ago, he'd been a man who thought love was a business transaction, a careful matching of compatible assets. Now he understood that love was messier, more complicated, and infinitely more beautiful than any spreadsheet could capture.
"Ruby," he said finally, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that whatever you answer, it won't change how I feel about you, or our future together." Ruby raised an eyebrow. "That's either very sweet or very terrifying." Daniel laughed, despite his nerves. "A little of both, maybe." He reached into the drawer where he'd been keeping Harold's ring for the past month, waiting for the right moment. Not a grand gesture or a perfect romantic setting, but a moment that felt true to who they were, to what they'd built together. "Ruby Johnson, Daniel said, dropping to one knee in his kitchen, still wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt stained with pancake batter. "Will you marry me?" Ruby's hands flew to her mouth, and Daniel saw tears spring to her eyes. "Daniel, I know it's crazy. I know 6 months isn't very long, and I know we still have so much to figure out. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life learning how to love you better. I want to build a home with you in Harold's house. I want to fill it with laughter and arguments and lazy Sunday mornings and all the beautiful, ordinary moments that make a life together." Daniel opened the ring box, revealing his grandmother's simple solitaire. This ring represents 53 years of choosing each other every single day. It represents the kind of love that doesn't just survive hardship, it grows stronger because of it. And I want that with you, Ruby. I want all of it. Ruby sank to her knees in front of him, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, yes, of course, yes." Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. They kissed there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the smell of burnt pancakes and the promise of everything they were going to build together. "Ruby," he said finally, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that whatever you answer, it won't change how I feel about you, or our future together." Ruby raised an eyebrow. "That's either very sweet or very terrifying." Daniel laughed, despite his nerves. "A little of both, maybe." He reached into the drawer where he'd been keeping Harold's ring for the past month, waiting for the right moment. Not a grand gesture or a perfect romantic setting, but a moment that felt true to who they were, to what they'd built together. "Ruby Johnson," Daniel said, dropping to one knee in his kitchen, still wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt stained with pancake batter, "will you marry me?" Ruby's hands flew to her mouth, and Daniel saw tears spring to her eyes. "Daniel, I know it's crazy. I know 6 months isn't very long, and I know we still have so much to figure out. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life learning how to love you better. I want to build a home with you in Harold's house. I want to fill it with laughter and arguments and lazy Sunday mornings and all the beautiful, ordinary moments that make a life together." Daniel opened the ring box, revealing his grandmother's simple solitaire. This ring represents 53 years of choosing each other every single day. It represents the kind of love that doesn't just survive hardship, it grows stronger because of it. And I want that with you, Ruby. I want all of it. Ruby sank to her knees in front of him, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, yes, of course, yes." Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. They kissed there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the smell of burnt pancakes and the promise of everything they were going to build together.
"I love you," Ruby said against his lips. "I love your terrible cooking and your brilliant mind and the way you make me want to be brave. I love that you see me, really see me, and love me anyway." "I love you too," Daniel said. "I love your compassion and your strength and the way you make the world better just by being in it. I love that you showed me what love actually looks like." They held each other there on the kitchen floor, and Daniel thought about all the ways his life had changed since that night in room 314. He'd learned that love wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone worth growing with. He'd learned that the best kind of wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in moments like this one, holding the woman he loved and knowing they were exactly where they belonged. "So," Ruby said eventually, pulling back to look at the ring on her finger, "when should we go look at Harold's house?"
"How about now?" Daniel said. "Mrs. Chen said she'd meet us there whenever we were ready." Ruby grinned. "Let me get dressed." And Daniel, "Yeah? Next time you want to propose, maybe let me handle the pancakes first. We nearly burned down our future home before we even saw it." Daniel laughed, pulling her to her feet. "Deal, but I'm warning you, I'm going to spend the rest of our lives trying to impress you with my domestic skills. And I'm going to spend the rest of our lives pretending to be impressed," Ruby said, kissing him again. As they got ready to visit Harold's house, their future home, Daniel felt a profound sense of completion. Not the restless satisfaction of a deal closed or a goal achieved, but the deep peace that came from finding exactly where you belonged. He thought about the 53 women he'd rejected, the careful lists and calculated compatibility assessments. None of it had mattered. Harold had been right. Love wasn't about finding someone who fit your requirements. It was about finding someone who made you want to throw away the requirements and build something entirely new. And as Daniel watched Ruby get dressed, already planning out loud how they'd turn Harold's workshop into a reading nook and his garden into a place for Sunday barbecues with their future children, Daniel knew they were about to build something beautiful, something that would last, something that would make Harold proud. What do you believe is the most important ingredient for lasting love? Have you ever found love in an unexpected place or moment? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love found its way into your life. 2 years later. The garden behind Harold's house was in full bloom, bursting with the tomatoes and sunflowers that Ruby had planted alongside Harold's original roses. Daniel sat on the back porch watching his wife of 18 months chase their 6-month-old daughter, Grace Emily Crawford, through the sprinkler. Grace had Ruby's eyes and Harold's stubborn chin, and she had already proven capable of wrapping both her parents around her tiny fingers. She also had an inexplicable fondness for the workshop, where Daniel had found Harold's final gift, a hand-carved cradle with a note that simply read, "For when you're ready to build something that really matters." "Daddy," Grace squealed as Ruby caught her up in a towel. And Daniel felt his heart expand in his chest. He'd built companies and accumulated wealth and achieved everything he thought he wanted, but nothing had prepared him for the profound joy of hearing that word from his daughter's lips. "How did we get so lucky?" Ruby asked, settling beside him on the porch swing Harold had built decades ago. Daniel pulled them both close, breathing in the scent of his wife's hair and his daughter's baby shampoo. Harold would say, "Love always finds a way." Harold was a wise man, Ruby agreed, using the phrase that had become their family motto. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Daniel thought about the winding path that had led them here. All those failed dates, all that searching for perfection, all those years of thinking he knew what love looked like. He'd been wrong about everything. Love wasn't perfect. It was Grace screaming at 3 a.m. and Ruby's hair in the shower drain, and arguments about whose turn it was to do dishes. It was Ruby holding his hand during business meetings that stressed him out, and Daniel reading bedtime stories in funny voices until Ruby laughed so hard she cried. It was choosing each other every day, even when, especially when, it wasn't easy. It was exactly what Harold had tried to tell him that night in the hospital. Love wasn't about finding someone who fit your life. It was about finding someone worth building a completely new life with. And as Daniel watched Ruby get dressed, already planning out loud how they'd turn Harold's workshop into a reading nook and his garden into a place for Sunday barbecues with their future children, Daniel knew they were about to build something beautiful. Something that would last. Something that would make Harold proud.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.